Hello, everyone. My name is Nora Burnett Abrams. I am the Mark G. Falcone Director at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Denver. And we want to welcome and thank you so much for joining us for the first in our 4-part series, NFTs, Putting the Fun in Non-Fungible Tokens, generously sponsored by Sotheby's.
And hi, I'm Amy Whitaker, a blockchain researcher in the arts and assistant professor of visual arts administration at New York University. Over the next 4 weeks, we'll take you on a journey to explore the potential impact of blockchain on the art market and on artists. Rather than talk around NFTs, we want to invite in many different voices of people who are making them, who are donating them to museums, who are critiquing them, especially with regard to the environment. And this week, the research scientists who developed the underlying technology of blockchain. Our aim is really to invite everyone into the conversation and to think about them together and to understand a timeline of them and also the technology itself so that without a PhD in cryptography, we can try to imagine these radical potential shifts in the power structure of the arts that may come about from this technology. We have a lot to cover, and we'll do our best to answer questions that come up. We really encourage you to share comments and questions in the chat. We'll do our best to address them now, or certainly to incorporate them into the next few weeks. So I'll turn it over to you, Nora.
Thank you. And Amy, maybe we should just acknowledge for a moment that this is kind of bringing the band back together since we had our first NFT conversation titled very eloquently, NFTs WTF back in April of this year. And really, frankly, based on the questions that were raised during that conversation that we had, as well as in subsequent conversations that really birthed kind of what we have designed today. So obviously tonight is the first in our 4-part series. And after today's episode on the origins of blockchain, we will focus episode 2 next Wednesday, October 27th, on artists and making of NFTs. The subsequent episode, number 3, on November 3rd, we'll cover collecting. And then the last episode on November 10th, we really want to explore kind of the new potential futures and possibilities for advancing equity and redistributing power within the art ecosystem. I want to say that if you can't, catch it live, please hit subscribe, the subscribe button below this screen, so that you don't miss future episodes, or you can catch them later on. We have a lot coming up, and of course, there's a ton of other great content and live stream events that are available there.
Great. And so for tonight's program, we have 3 goals. We're looking at the origins of blockchain itself, and we want to define terms to understand what blockchain is and the technology. And we want to talk about the backstory, where it comes from, how we understand it as an art project unto itself, and how we have a working knowledge at the timeline from blockchain to NFTs. And then we want to invite questions about the creative possibilities, as Nora says, kind of how this may change our ecosystem. And that's really to introduce a set of intersecting stories. So when we talk about blockchain, often we're talking about a technology story or a market story or a money story, but we're increasingly talking about stories of artists and economic sustainability, and especially of democracy and the way that blockchain may change governance and community as well as market structures. So to introduce these stories, we want to start way back at the beginning. By the time we finish this program, the beginning will be in the 1970s. But for now, when we start at the beginning of NFTs, we're not talking about 2018. And we're not even talking about 2009 and the launch of the Bitcoin blockchain, but 1990, which is when Stuart Haber and Scott Stornetta, a cryptographer and a physicist, respectively, first imagined and built a working prototype of the distributed ledger, which is the structure of blockchain. And their work did not start with a money story, although many parts of Bitcoin did, coming out of crypto anarchist movements. It started with a knowledge story. And the question was, in an age of digital records, how will we know what was true about the past? And how can we know that without having to trust a central administrator to keep the record?
So join us. And without further ado, I really want to thank Adam Lipsius, one of MCA Denver's board members and a filmmaker who directed this video that really will introduce Stuart Haber and Scott Stornetta.
Because this is 1991, the World Wide Web did not exist.
When you're going to have to show up in court with evidence of how thrilled you were.
I'm real happy about that because we got the response back in like 2 seconds.
The world was clearly going digital.
And therefore, the entire substrate on which civilization was going to be built was going to be subject to tampering. You know, collapse of civilization without the zombie part.
Stuart, what is digital timestamping?
Digital timestamping is a method to prove when a computer document was created.
So I'm Scott Stornetta. You know, if we're playing What's My Line, it's that I worked with Stuart Haber.
Hi, I'm Stuart Haber.
We've seen so many scandals lately, the Daiwa scandal, the Sumitomo scandal, and so digital notary...
I was really obsessed with this issue about how are we going to create immutable records.
As everybody knows, you can change a file and muck with the date.
I thought about it all the time. Having a resume that just said, likes to think about interesting problems, was just kind of hard to match positions with. So I remember the first time I met Stuart was in spring of 1989 when I was still interviewing with Belcore.
I'd been there for all of 2 years, so I was an old hand, but I was still a new researcher. It felt like, you know, being paid a real salary to do what I wanted. It was a ridiculously cushy job.
You could get hired and walk in, and rather than be told what to work on, you could say, this is an important problem, therefore I'm entitled to work on it.
Well, Scott knocked on my door to say hello. Maybe he waited till the next day, but maybe it was the very, very first conversation. Because it was on his mind.
I approached Stuart as the only cryptologist that I knew at Belcore and said, this is going to be a really important problem someday. We should solve this problem before the smart people, you know, get a crack at it.
The system is called the Digital Notary Service, and it's the brainchild of two former Belcore researchers.
Digital notary service is a way to take any electronic record, a word processing file, a piece of email, some image, any electronic record, and seal it in content and time.
A secure digital timestamping solution that did not require trust seemed on the face of it impossible.
We'd worked on it for a while, and Stuart said, Scott, you know, don't mean to burst your bubble, but I don't think this problem can be solved.
And we couldn't see how to do it.
So why don't we write a proof for why you can never remove trust from a system? And so I kind of grudgingly agreed. Stuart and I, this was the fall and winter of 89, 90, and Stuart and I were trying to, at that point, prove that there was no way to remove trust from a system.
And Scott worked really long hours, and it was like rarely, I was going crazy with the kids half the time.
We're waiting in line just to get a table, and I'm reviewing the argument with Stuart that we had earlier.
Because he always does these things in his head.
Because I'm always thinking about
He's
him.
always talking to himself.
And that was the moment when I realized that the way we were posing it as a problem, in a sense, you could turn the proof that you can't remove trust, you can turn it around. If you could take digital records and link them together and then distribute them throughout the world of witnesses and have everyone able to view what is occurring, then you have in fact solved the problem, not defined why it can't be solved.
The Friendlies at Morristown is where Scott Stornetta got the idea for the blockchain and distributed ledger.
Unbeknownst to me, something was happening at this very Friendlies restaurant.
The paper that they published in 1991 is one of the classics in the crypto literature. It's really the foundation of all the papers that come afterwards. A revolution began here, a new type of money, a new type of payment system. It ends up to be a very pivotal location in the history of finance.
Digital notary is also affordable, costing only a few $100s a year for unlimited use. And in the future, it will be automatically integrated into computer systems.
They'll just be able to turn it on inside of...
For so many years, I felt like Stuart and I and a very small group of people had been trying to evangelize this, take this gospel to the world, if you will. Look at how this thing has grown.
We ended up with something new. And trying to set out into the wild territory what came from Scott.
There's so often this dynamical balance between the two people that help bring out the best of both parties. That's clearly been the way with Stuart and myself. He befriended me. He was willing to work with someone that didn't know anything, just because that person really cared about the problem.
History could easily have gone differently. Scott and I did not explicitly concentrate on financial applications. We had all applications in mind. We weren't inventing digital currency, but digital currency did need our solution.
You feel like you may have been a small piece in the picture, but you undeniably were a piece in the picture.
Great stuff. Thanks to Adam Lipsius and his whole team. And also thanks to Stuart Haber and Scott and Marcia Stornetta for sharing their stories, and to Professor David Urmak, who joins us a little later in the program. I think one of the things Nora mentioned when we were looking at this video was to think about interesting problems. The way Scott describes their work has so much resonance with what artists do. And I've often referred to Scott and Stuart as kind of Van Gogh circa 1890 with regard to the blockchain. Their work constitutes 3 of 8 footnotes in Satoshi Nakamoto's Bitcoin white paper. And at the same time, as part of their timestamping service that they described in the video, they published a weekly alphanumeric code in the Sunday New York Times. And as of last week, on October 13th, that project, a kind of an art project, certainly, the oldest blockchain in the world, turned 30. Stuart and Scott are working on launching their early papers as an NFT, something I helped them with a little bit over the summer. But I think this really kind of sets up this theme of blockchain as an art project, and art as this inquiry, this process of experimentation and inquiry.
Absolutely. And I would just, to chime in on that, Amy, it really underscores how thinking about a problem from as I loved Scott's hand gestures about, really brought it to life. And just in terms of looking at something from the exact opposite angle and how that opened things up. Because honestly, I find that artists often take that approach. They look at something kind of, obliquely and help open up a problem that may appear vexing and impossible to solve. So I think that making that connection and shifting the lens around the origin of this technology to be one as a creative kind of artist story is really amazing.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Nora. I love that. And they're concerned with knowledge. That knowledge story also shares.
Oh, Amy.
So many affinities with the and record keeping. Is it my internet or your internet?
It was just for a moment, but we're back. You're good. You're clear.
Okay, you went out too, so I'm not sure what happened, but it's really exciting to be reunited with the band again and again. Well, it's a nice kind of break point because we're about to go into the timeline. Did you want to say something else before I?
Nope.
So we mentioned that one of our goals for tonight is to go through a working timeline, and we'll kind of take us from what is, if Haber and Stornetta are the prequel, what is the starting point of the Bitcoin blockchain, which is the launch of the Genesis block by Satoshi Nakamoto in January of 2009 after circulating a white paper the fall before. And we could start there, or we could start kind of in the recent present with the the instigation for how we're all talking about this NFT phenomenon, which is probably the sale of Beeple, Mike Winkelmann's work, Every Day is the First 5,000 Days, for $69.346 million. And I think what we really want to do first is talk about the space between the origins of the Bitcoin blockchain and NFTs right now.
And I think we even want to go further back all the way to, the origins of time, or just kidding, the late 60s and early 70s, that kind of nascent moment of conceptual art, and in particular to the work of artist Saul LeWitt, whose wall drawings, which were always accompanied by what he termed to be a certificate of authenticity, how that kind of echoes and even anticipates the structure of an NFT now.
You sounded very nicely 1970s there for a moment. The origins of time. I'm sorry, we can't cue like a Earth, Wind, and Fire or something. So we want to take you through a timeline, and this goes from 1990, when Haber and Stornetta first presented their work at a conference before they published that paper in 1991, through the Nakamoto launch of Bitcoin in 2009, and start into the NFT story with Kevin McCoy's first NFT in 2014, Beatrice Ramos and Judy Mam's founding of the drawing collective Dada, Vitalik Buterin's launch of the Ethereum blockchain itself, and then this wave of projects that came in 2017, including Matt Hall and John Watkinson's work as Larva Labs collective to make the Cryptopunks, and then Dapper Labs' launch of the Cryptokitties, which introduced the ERC 721 token, which was then codified into the non-fungible token that we talk about now. So we want to take each of these kind of one step at a time, and start in 2014 with what's definitely an artist story. My colleague, Kevin McCoy at NYU, he joins us next week with his partner and collaborator, Jennifer McCoy, created the very first NFT as part of a collaboration with the technologist Anil Dash for Rhizome's 7-on-7 program of pairing artists and technologists to make work. Ethereum did not exist. Quantum, as this first NFT is called, was built on Namecoin, an offshoot of the Bitcoin blockchain that allowed a kind of original object in the form of a name. We'll hear much more about this story next week. That same year, Beatrice Ramos and Judy Mam founded an online drawing collective called Dada, which was a kind of visual conversation. The project also predated Ethereum, but was subsequently curated and minted as a collection of NFTs that's called Creeps and Weirdos. This collection is currently for sale. We get to talk to Judy and Bea about this project in week 3. And Metakovan, or Vignesh Sundarasan, who's the buyer of the $70 million Beeple, also just purchased a full set of Creeps and Weirdos. So what we know as an NFT exists on the Ethereum blockchain, which was launched in 2015. Ethereum is a nonprofit organization founded by Vitalik Buterin, who first learned about blockchain from his dad, basically in high school. We're extremely fortunate to be able to hear from Vitalik himself, again, these artists of the technology itself, via video of an interview that Hans-Ulrich Obrist, the artistic director of the Serpentine, who has a very long-term practice of interviewing people, really since he was the age at which Vitalik discovered blockchain. They have both very graciously shared the video with us that was conducted for a 2018 interview in Tank magazine. And we're showing just a very small clip of it, with our thanks to both of them.
So as an analogy, here's the best one I can think of. The stuff that came before Ethereum was a Swiss Army knife, and Ethereum is like a Swiss Army knife that contains a tiny built-in 3D printer that prints exactly what component you want to use on demand. With Ethereum, with a phone, the difference is that there's like 1,000 things that you can do with it, and if you want to do a new thing, you just have to download an app, right? Yeah. So that was kind of the idea that I was trying to go for Ethereum. Like basically, instead of kind of defining the protocol in terms of things that you can do with it, define the protocol in terms of building blocks, and so you can be kind of open-ended. A blockchain is this weird thing that's like somewhere right in between an open source project, a corporation, and a country. I even add like a fourth thing, which would be a language. Languages can be global, and like the people that make up a community around a language are pretty much anyone that makes a decision to learn it. It has some of the properties of all four of them, but it's also not quite like any of them. If you look at something like, let's say, e-commerce versus regular commerce, right? The main benefit of e-commerce is basically convenience, right? But if you look at, why would you do things on a blockchain instead of doing things using the internet? The answer basically is that it's about trust, right? So, like, ultimately, anything that you can do with a blockchain, you can already do with the internet if you can find people you trust. I mean, like, the non-profit aspect is definitely, I think, like I feel like it ties into the same kind of difference of vision, whereas, like, the for-profits think of it as they are the ones providing the solution to the world. I feel like we think of it as we are a mechanism where the world can provide a solution to itself, where we're just the facilitators that write the code.
Great. So our thanks again to them, and also to Hans Ulrich's team and the editor of Tank Magazine for sharing that work with us. The longer interview really gives some sense of how iterative and creative the process of development was, from long walks in San Francisco to writing for early Bitcoin blogs and being paid in Bitcoins. It's a kind of extraordinary story. So the launch of Ethereum is really what created the NFT environment that we're currently in. And some of the early projects, really foundational projects, are the Cryptopunks, again, made by Matt Hall and John Watkinson. And there are many other creators of digital collectibles. We can't name them all. But what's interesting is they gave them away for free originally. One had to pay kind of a gas fee for the transaction cost of using Ethereum, but those now sell for into the millions of dollars. Kind of again introducing these very peculiar art and money story overlaps. Shortly after that, Dapper Labs created Cryptokitties, and it was a game where people could breed cats. They created the programming standard underneath Cryptokitties, which is what we know as the ERC 721 non-fungible token. They presented it as a proposal, a kind of request for comments, and it was accepted in January of 2018. So that kind of takes us through this space from the early development of Bitcoin, the early development of the Ethereum blockchain, some of these artistic experiments before and after. And now that we're talking about cats on the internet, we should get back to the blockchain itself, sort of the technology. And technologically, blockchain is made up of a few interlocking parts that really come out of cryptography and mathematics. And here to explain them in about 3 minutes is the cryptographer Joseph Bonneau, and we have illustrations by Claire Schlaker.
I've always thought it's kind of a nickname for a public append-only ledger or a bulletin board. So a place where people around the world can post data and everybody will see the same data. That's kind of the bulletin board part. And the append-only part is that you can only add data. So once data is written to a blockchain, it's never removed. It's always going to be there. It's actually a fairly straightforward term. You have blocks of transactions and they're chained together. Each block is chained to the last block by including the hash of the previous block. The first block is kind of special, and it's called the Genesis block. So the Genesis block has to be created by somebody or some organization, and everybody just has to agree on it. Different blockchain systems have a different process for adding new blocks to the chain. Some systems like Bitcoin use proof of work with lots of different trade-offs in terms of cost and efficiency, environmental impacts. A hash function is something that takes a large, unbounded amount of data, an entire movie file, the entire contents of the Library of Congress, or you could just hash one PDF file. And you always get a fixed, what's called a hash digest, or sometimes a fingerprint, which represent that entire object. And the one-way part means that once you've computed it, if you just have the output, there's no way to go back and find the input. A Merkle tree is just a way of using a hash function in a tree-like structure. to produce a commitment to a set of objects. You repeatedly, hash pairs and then pairs of pairs and pairs and pairs of pairs of items until eventually you get just one hash that represents the full set. So if you have 1,000 transactions in a Bitcoin block, they're represented by just one value, which is this root of a Merkle tree computed on all of the transactions in the block. The actual algorithm, and it's almost a stretch to even call it an algorithm, but the algorithm for finding a Bitcoin block is just put all the pieces in place that are fixed, like the time and the transactions in the previous block, and then try every possible value for the nonce until you find one that happens to make it have this magic property and solve the puzzle. But it's really just a computer doing guess and check very, very quickly, trying billions of possibilities a second. From a cryptography or security standpoint, the notion of NFTs is pretty simple. It's just using a blockchain to track ownership of a digital object. It's one of the simplest applications of a smart contract. So all the technical properties are very easy to ensure. I think the difficulty is what the real world meaning of an NFT is, which is a place where cryptographers can't really help you.
I love his ending with that question.
I know. I was expecting cryptographers to always help us with blockchain, and I was like, oh, back over to us.
Exactly. Well, and it returns us to the this kind of origin story again. And this is, in fact, the origin of how Amy and I started talking about what would become this program, which was the recognition that some of the language used around NFTs really echoes the kind of advances that happened in the late 60s and early 70s with regard to conceptual art. We're looking specifically at a wall drawing by Sol LeWitt. It's wall drawing 51 from 1970. And the kind of connection, I would say, that really is so resonant is that this is one presentation of the work. This happens to be at Mass MoCA in North Adams, Massachusetts, but it could be replicated on anyone's wall who acquires the work. But the way that you can prove that it's actually a work of Sol LeWitt's and not a work by Amy Whitaker, for example, is a certificate of authenticity, is a contract, if you will, that kind of legitimizes and authorizes the work of art as a work by Sol and as an original. And that kind of structure is what we wanted to kind of call out and connect back to. And again, it underscores the origins of this technology really as having this kind of creative and artistic kind of proto story or prologue, if you will. And so to go a little bit more deeply into this, we engaged Chris Vacchio, who is the director of research for the Sol LeWitt Wall Drawings Catalog Raisonné. I think we can pretty confidently say a leading expert on wall drawings and the structure that Sol really advanced.
LeWitt, at the very beginning, he didn't have a really strong idea of how he wanted to sell these and how he wanted ownership of essentially ideas to work. So there were a lot of early certificates where it would be a signed photo of the work as installed on the wall or written instructions with a signature, and to try and make it a little more official, he would write in all caps, "This is a certificate." But it wasn't until the mid-1980s when he had his first print catalog raisonné, which is an accounting of all of his wall drawings up until that point, that he decided to go back and standardize and have an official printed and signed certificate for every single wall drawing, whether it had been sold or not. And so those are the certificates that are still in use today.
Great. So, I mean, I think that is really such an interesting starting point to talk, as you did, Nora, about Sol LeWitt's work. And I want to say just briefly, we're very indebted to Chris Vacchio and also to Nora's and my common friend, Veronica Roberts, who was a prior director of research for the LeWitt Catalog Raisonné, that those works have this really unusual property of I could have the drawing on my wall, but if I don't have the certificate, and Nora and I were talking about how this is so different and such a seismic shift from the way that we traditionally think about art, where we have the vaunted original, the aura of the original, according to Walter Benjamin, something like the Mona Lisa, and that we can go from one to many by putting it on mugs. And now, as we're all grappling with digital work and the way in which there are infinitely many copies, and we have many of something like the Nyan cat, which has been circulating as a meme for a decade, and now there's an NFT, so someone owns just one of them. And what's especially peculiar about this is that in the world of these NFTs, we're actually in some cases going from many to one and then back to many, because, for example, the Metakovan purchase of this Beeple work was put into the MetaPurse fund so that it could then be sold in this kind of economic story of democratization of access to investing in art. So there's really a lot for us to unpack here, and we're extremely fortunate that we have David Urmak, the chair of the finance department at NYU Stern and a very distinguished blockchain expert, to really help us make sense of this, not just within the art market where we may look back on the $450 million Salvador Mundi sale as quaint in the way that someone might see the 1980 sale of Jasper John's Three Flags as quaint now, but really kind of how we look at this rapid transformation and change in the art market, but also recognize that the arts is a small kind of planet within this larger solar system. So just to briefly introduce David as we welcome him, he's an unusually creative and polymathic scholar who's written on everything from Mrs. Obama's fashion and the effect on markets to board governance of art museums around endowments. I want to say a special welcome to David, who's the original rediscoverer of Haber and Stornetta's work, to the Urmak family, and especially to Mr. and Mrs. Urmak, and happy birthday to Mr. Urmak for tomorrow. Hi, David.
Welcome.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for that intro.
It's so great to have you with us. I'll lob a question your way, and then I know Nora will join. We have lots of questions for you, and we're so appreciative of your being here to help us kind of make sense and synthesize and contextualize. So it's happened in my knowledge of you that I will send you something that's a remarkable news story from the art world, and you'll send me back an email that's like, anyway, someone actually paid 10 times that much for an ape and a penguin. And I just wonder if you can kind of help us get a little context. How are you seeing this development of NFTs in the art world in a much bigger picture?
The value of the blockchain is really to fix ownership and the history of who has not only had possession, but maybe even who has altered or added to a work of art. So provenance is almost a timeless problem of knowing first who created.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, David. Is it quiet? Is your mic? Could you move your mic closer or turn your volume up, please?
I'm sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. The importance of the blockchain is really to establish provenance, to know who created a work of art, who then sold it, who had the subsequent possession of it, and in some cases, who may have added to it or taken care of it in such a way that these paintings and other works of arts classically have had interesting histories. You probably know the story of the Vermeer, where they discovered a Cupid this summer that had been there, hundreds of years ago. And what the blockchain gives us is a way to keep track of these things with unconditional certainty that they were actually true at the time that they entered the ledger. The digital art that you're seeing with the Cryptopunks and the Cryptokitties and the work of Beeple is really quite interesting because we know that we can make a perfect copy of it. In fact, you've shown in this program some exact copies of works that people paid millions of dollars for. But what the blockchain gives you is the prestige of ownership. You can prove that you were the one who had the original. And I think a lot of what is driving the market is simply the bragging rights, which have always been important in collecting art. People like to collect things that are scarce and to have things that other people cannot have. So I think there's a lot of digital art that's quite interesting to look at, but we can all look at it on our PCs at home. but the blockchain gives incontrovertible proof of who the true owner is and also who the true creator is, to the extent that may be in dispute.
And I think that's so interesting for the art market side of the development of blockchain and the arts. And we're also trying to think a little bit about the creativity of what's happening for artists and makers. And I feel in a way, having heard you speak about this in a finance and law context, that it's possible that NFTs and blockchain will actually change radically the structure of financial markets and the way people work and the jobs they have. As much as we're thinking about that change in the arts, you're thinking about that change kind of writ large. Is that true?
Yeah, I think if you take a look at the industry, if we want to call it an industry of the arts, there are so many people whose job is simply to keep track of things. There are curators and catalog providers, the work done at art fairs like Art Basel, the work of galleries, is ultimately about authenticating things and bringing buyers and sellers together. And the blockchain can do that with a greater level of certainty and without the need to trust people, because as we all know, there have been many scandals and forgeries and things that have been lost and then rediscovered. The blockchain can solve many of these problems. And I think in society at large, it's not a great leap to say that if we can authenticate works of art, we can also authenticate luxury goods. So there are applications for things like Louis Vuitton handbags to prove that they're not fake, to track gemstones to prove that they're not from conflict areas that we wouldn't want to subsidize. So blockchains have been used to keep track of any number of things where the systems that have been in place for hundreds of years are not completely reliable. It's essentially a mechanism for creating unconditional trust. And potentially this is enormously valuable in finance and the arts, in medicine, in every field where data is important.
Well, it's also in every field where trust is important and where being able, it's interesting that is kind of a theme that so many different participants tonight have called out, that the question that everyone, it seems to almost be solving for, is such a human story of how to ensure, how to allow us to trust one another and how to stave off any nefarious agents, because there are nefarious agents, because there are individuals and entities that aren't, that are duplicitous, let's say. But whether it's, Scott and Stuart, as you're framing it, Vitalik, et cetera, it does really seem so, it's an aspect of this kind of phenomenon that maybe hasn't gotten as much attention because of the spectacle of so many other aspects of the phenomenon.
The Economist magazine famously called the blockchain a trust machine, that it allows you to take a piece of information and validate the truth of it without having to worry about the reputations of the people involved. You don't need to hire an auditing firm. In fact, it really replaces the auditing firm, because auditing firms themselves have had plenty of scandals and mishaps. There's no shortage of reasons not to trust them.
Oh no, our auditors are joining tonight. Oh yeah.
No one should take this personally, but this ultimately was a project started by libertarians who began with the idea that nobody can be trusted. That as soon as you place trust in an individual person, you open the door to bribery, forgery, conflicts of interest, all kinds of problems that we can identify in any number of institutions, in governments, in banks, and so forth. And the idea of building a digital currency like Bitcoin was, to a great extent, a reaction to the failures of banks that have been occurring since the time of the Roman Empire, but occurred in large number in 2008 and 2009 when Bitcoin was rolling out. And it was actually a project that had begun 27 years earlier. The first digital currency was experimented with in 1982. And eventually they stumbled on the work of Scott and Stuart, which was taking place at almost the same time. And the ledger that they developed turned out to be ideal for solving this problem of a digital currency. But as we saw in the video, it was almost the last thing on those guys' minds. They never really thought of the financial piece and were much more interested in creative property. They really their point of departure was works of art, tracks of digital music. But it turns out that the problems in the arts and the problems in finance, they really overlap to a great extent. And we need to be able to authenticate things and to prove ownership. And this has been a challenge for thousands of years. And we now have, what I tell my students in finance classes is that this is an innovation on par with double entry bookkeeping, which came in 700 years ago in the Renaissance. It made many things possible in capitalism and investment and so forth. But you now have really a superior way to keep records. It's the biggest thing in financial accounting in 700 odd years, but it's also something that maps very easily into supply chain, into medical records, government records, border security, and of course the arts.
I know we want to ask you a couple of other big questions, but just to respond to what you said about trust, there is a passage in the Vitalik interview with Hans-Ulrich Obrist that we didn't include, but he says essentially that the difference between him and Mark Zuckerberg is that he tried to design a system that could imagine himself as an adversary. And I think that's such an interesting point from a governance standpoint of kind of what blockchain does, the way that to truly build a system based on trust. I mean, this is kind of a democratic ideal, right? You need a governance system that can deal with your becoming a bad actor.
Yeah, I've told my colleagues that Vitalik is probably the most important person in finance. And the reactions that I get range from who to you got to be kidding me. But I think his imagination to build out the Ethereum blockchain with all of the flexibility and versatility has been an immense contribution to this whole area. And the whole attitude that you explained is exactly right, that you want to imagine people will try to attack and subvert this. And I couldn't think of a better attacker or opponent than Vitalik. He's almost unique in that sense, but They have designed something that's extremely robust, and it builds on the work of Bitcoin and ultimately the work of Stewart and Scott. And it brings together many ideas from computer science with ideas from game theory and economics. And the bottom principle that ties all this together, though, is that nobody should be trusted. Never put trust in an individual. You're trusting the cryptography and the algorithm here. And this is a very interesting twist on an idea that's been around for a long, long time.
And I mean, it strikes me as a bit of a democratic ideal that you wouldn't want to have a philosopher king, which is a trust in one person, however wonderful they are, but a system that can work no matter what. I want to ask you one difficult question and one story. And Nora, you may have other questions too. The difficult question is, in planning this program, we've taken really seriously a lot of the criticisms leveled at blockchain, namely in terms of the environmental impact. And we want to take that really seriously. And next week, we'll talk about it even more with artists who are making choices about what blockchain protocols to use. But David, I'm wondering if you can just kind of talk about that and help us frame that a little bit.
So the way that Bitcoin and Ethereum and many of the important blockchains work is an idea called proof of work, where in the case of Bitcoin, every 10 minutes, there's a worldwide competition to solve a puzzle, as Joe Bonneau was speaking about in his video. In Ethereum, the competition is much quicker. It's every 12 seconds, but it's the same competition where you're just burning computer energy to guess random numbers and hopefully by trial and error complete a crypto puzzle. It's a lot of energy that you need to do this on a large scale. And people have calculated that Bitcoin uses as much energy as a mid-sized country. And they then ask the question, what good is this for the world? How can we justify this when the planet is getting warmer and so forth? I think there's a couple of responses that you need to keep in mind. And one is that the incentives for this proof of work really drive you to use renewable energy with zero marginal cost. And where people tend to be building Bitcoin mines is where there are high winds and abundant hydropower, geothermal power in Iceland, that it's not just out of the goodness of their hearts, but the actual incentives to be an effective crypto miner will drive people to use renewables. And more than half of the energy on the Bitcoin blockchain now is renewable energy. And I think in the long run, it's going to be the vast majority. The other thing is that we have many other things in the world that use energy. In fact, I read a week ago that the amount of energy used for gold mining last year was equivalent to the amount of energy used in Bitcoin mining. And people are up in arms about the use of energy for mining Bitcoin, but no one seems to find this remarkable for mining gold. And you can talk about things like hair dryers or video games. There are lots of things that use energy where you can question the social good of it. If we're really worried about energy consumption, we can put in place carbon taxes. There are very straightforward ways to regulate this, but I find it puzzling that we would discriminate against a certain type of consumption. I think you have to treat all users of electricity on an even-handed basis and let the market sort this out based on supply and demand. And I'm not sure that we can put value judgments on whether Bitcoin mining is worse than gold mining, which is better than air travel and all of the other things that we use to burn fossil fuels for.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things Nora and I talked about a little bit in planning conversations was this larger theme of trying to negotiate the role of the individual and the role of the system. I can recycle an aluminum can, but I don't understand the imprint of my larger power footprint necessarily, or the sort of even larger system of reliance on fossil fuels. I completely agree with you. And I think it's interesting that the same sort of property rights systems that underlie NFTs underlie the field of economics that's concerned, maybe not with the carbon taxes, but with emissions permits, for example. So that's a really interesting framing. The question I want to ask you to close is for you to tell us the story of how you rediscovered Haber and Stornetta's work, but I want to turn it over to Nora first. You may have some questions or kind of ways of helping us synthesize.
Well, I would love to be able to hear from you, David, how you I connected with them, and I believe I know where that connection took place, already featured prominently in the earlier video. But I really, this may be too big of a question to end on, but given what is happening with potential legislation and the conversations that are happening in Washington, do you see that kind of regulation of the crypto market as something coming soon, or do you see it as further afield?
I think the regulators are grossly overconfident about their ability to regulate this. If you look at most financial regulation, you rely on the intermediaries. So we ask banks to collect data about payments that go through customer accounts, and we ask the clearinghouse at the stock exchange to keep records of stock trades. There's always a central repository where the regulation is focused. Blockchains are decentralized. There's nobody in charge. There's no central node. And you have to vacuum up this data one customer at a time instead of relying on the bank, the mint, the clearinghouse, whatever you want to call that entity. And regulators don't know how to do that. I don't think the technology exists. And the people who designed it, you have to bear in mind that these are libertarians who don't like governments, and they designed it by its very nature to be unregulable. So you hear an awful lot of chest thumping coming out of Washington about how this has to be banned, this has to be regulated. Good luck. I mean, it can't be done. And I think the sooner the regulators make peace with this, the better. And there are lots of interesting questions about who's going to be minting money in the future, whether it's still going to be the central bank or whether it's going to be independent people on blockchains. And that's really where the government needs to be concerned.
Thank you.
Well, just to close out this kind of looking at the system and the work of the individual, including professors who actually read all of the papers and the footnotes of what they're teaching, will you give us in a nutshell version of how you rediscovered Haber and Stornetta?
So I think this would be in 2015. I was writing one of my first papers and was rereading the Haber and Stornetta paper because it is really the starting point for a lot of the work in this area. And on the title page is an address in Morristown, New Jersey that happened to be about 1 mile from my house, where I was sitting at that moment working on the paper, and where I'm sitting right now, in fact. And I was really surprised. I thought this was developed, right around the corner from where I live. And then I Googled these guys to see if they were still local. And Scott was teaching math in Maplewood High School, a couple of miles away. And I emailed him. I said, "Are you the creator of the blockchain from 28 years ago?" And he wrote back. He said, "Yeah, thanks for noticing." And we agreed to meet. He said, "Let's meet at Friendly's Ice Cream because it's historically important." And this, of course, is the Friendly's that was in the video, and it's also the Friendly's where I've been taking my kids for ice cream for more than 20 years. It's not far from where I live. And so we met, and I heard his story, and I said, "You've got to come into class and tell this to the students." And so he did. And Amy, that you and I kind of initiated the reunion, that Scott and Stuart had not been in touch for maybe the better part of 20 years. And we set out to locate Stuart, and then Scott got involved. And as we saw in the video, they're back together, working together on blockchain projects, but also collecting a lot of accolades and rewards for a really interesting contribution that spans not just the fields of finance and economics and the arts, but any industry where data is important. And in the modern world, that's pretty much all of them.
I love that.
David, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to speak with you.
Well, thank you for having me on the program.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think David really kind of teed up what you said earlier, Nora, about the exploration of interesting questions in and of themselves, where you sometimes don't know what will come of them. And this, to me, is the art project of blockchain, the kind of inventing point B, inventing the world kind of definition of art. So what we hope we've done today is to tee up this set of interlocking stories, and we've talked about the timeline, so we all have a kind of working knowledge of the development of the technology, and these very kind of early art projects in the NFT digital collectible space. And as we go through this series, we will get to explore many different aspects of these stories and how they fit together. But I think starting with the knowledge story, not just the libertarian money story and not just the art market story, but thinking really creatively and structurally about explorations that artists are undertaking to share equity and risk and operate in collective ways, and the way that these technological influences may change the power structures of the art. So Nora, let me turn it over to you to add anything.
I think you summed everything up beautifully. And I think that our intention, again, to just kind of underscore with this entire 4-part series is to really understand and share out, what is the history, what are the facts, what really transpired and when, and then to see where it might lead and to really explore what those possibilities of that this phenomenon has ushered in, and also where it could lead, negative, positive, who knows, but to think through it, and as you said, Amy, very creatively and imaginatively. So how it could kind of reinvent the art market, how it can reimagine the power that artists may kind of acquire or at least retain, let's say, and to really think of the blockchain as an opportunity, if not a mechanism for rebuilding, reimagining, and restructuring these kind of pillars of certainly the art ecosystem, but as David suggested, really kind of well beyond our kind of small part of the universe.
I love that. So I know we want to open it up to questions, and I just want to say I was reading some of the comments while Nora was helping us synthesize. And Nora, you can tell people how to sign up for the other sessions, and these videos will stay online, and you can engage and share questions via social media. Nora, if you want to take any of those logistics, and then we can talk about some of the substantive questions. I can tee up a couple of those too. But just a warm welcome to everyone all over the world. It's really wonderful to see so many people and the people we know. Thanks so much for coming as well.
Absolutely. Yes. As Amy said, this is obviously a chance to express and share out any questions. As they always say, whatever question you have, it's likely someone else has it. So please do add it to the chat. And I think there was a question of if we don't get to everything today, How will we address it? Well, we will certainly try and address questions in subsequent sessions that we have. Again, it's each Wednesday for the next 3 weeks. October 27th focuses on artists and making. November 3rd focuses on collectors and buying. Thank you, Cheyenne. And November 10th focuses on equity and future states. And, we certainly recognize that this might have been a ton of new information. It may be old hat for some of you as well. The intention with this program overall is to really be a kind of primer, a resource that, as Amy said earlier, you don't need a PhD in cryptography in order to access. But nonetheless, it was a lot of information that we tried to pull together. So do let us know if you have questions about what was shared and what was presented. And Amy, I would love to just maybe ask you a question to
sure.
Which is how do you see, and maybe it's really less about NFT and it's really more about blockchain, but how do you see blockchain as, how do you address the answer or propose an answer potentially to Joe Bonneau's question at the end? Because there's so much possibility in that, and maybe it requires, I'm going to bungle it if I try to repeat it, but I know you know it.
So, it's interesting. Your question really dovetails with this question I was looking at in the comments. Can an NFT be a copy of an original that has already been sold? And I mean, Joe really gave us these structural basics, right? This trust machine, as David was quoting The Economist, that it's an append-only bulletin board. So it's an immutable record, to use a phrase that Scott Stornetta often uses. So it's immutable, but that doesn't mean it's perfect or that it's always correct, right? There's a famous case a few years ago where a man named Terence Eden listed the Mona Lisa on a blockchain registry as his own work. And obviously Terence Eden, who is alive today, as far as I know, did not make the Mona Lisa. But once it's there, you can't take it off. So the origin point becomes really interesting. And I think I'm reading some of the comments, that this is quite sad to do away with trust, that trust is what connects us in communities. And I think in a funny way, we rely on trust just as much. We're collaborating to do this program. Haber and Stornetta are working together, that in the same way that I still print a lot of documents, even though I can read them on screen, and maybe I print even more, having this system that replaces trust may free us up to work in community more. So I think to take your question, Nora, cryptographers have given us these tools, almost like a car, and then we have to decide where we want to drive it. And one of the really remarkable structural things that blockchain can do is to register ownership and to create a governance structure in which that ownership is publicly accessible to all of us. I'm not overlooking the environmental footprint of that, but just to speak about it as a structure like a democracy, a governance structure. And what I'm really excited to do by the end of this program is to talk about the ways in which that can fundamentally change the economics for artists. And we're seeing that already underneath these glittery, large marquee prices. We're seeing artists start to retain equity in their work more easily. So to have resale royalties in art become much more normalized because they can be accomplished much more easily technologically. And we're starting to see artists form cooperative economic structures to share risk and proceeds across their work. So in a way, that's a story of community and trust that's enabled by technology.
Thank you. Looks like we have another question that is definitely more for you than for me, which is, what are some of the legal problems, landmines, or ambiguity around NFTs as an asset class over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we're going to talk about it a lot more in the third session with some people who are collectors and bringing in a finance professional, Sandy Lee, who has affinities to the arts, to talk us through some of the regulatory environments, which are complicated by the digital nature of NFTs, because anti-money laundering law and GDPR and privacy intersect in these peculiar ways. And those systems, as David Urmak was saying, I'm not qualified enough to say if the US regulatory system is overconfident, but I can certainly tell you it's built for much more analog worlds where people and not organizations or decentralized autonomous organizations are acquiring works of art. So I think we see a lot of kind of legal complications that just have to be navigated, and that in the language that Nora and I have used require a kaleidoscopic set of lenses. So we'll definitely talk about that a lot more. Art is already a peculiar asset class. As someone who teaches art markets, art doesn't have valuation the way that public equities do. It doesn't have cash flows. So in a funny way, I think there's a storyline in which the art market has a lot to tell people about the burgeoning NFT world, because NFTs are uncannily like art. Like, they're worth something, but you're not exactly sure why or how much. So I think there's a lot that we'll get into. Nora, I wanted to ask you a question, which is just as someone who works with artists so much and is such a creative curator, and what are some of the things you see from the kind of art historical point of view, from running a museum that is a non-collecting institution? So you're doing this amazing program with like the Jason Moran's of the world, and kind of what do you see from that perspective?
Well, I think honestly, the reason I am in the role that I am in, and the reason that I've chosen the career that I have, is in part because I think artists are like always the seers or the truth tellers. They show us the way forward, particularly in the moment that we are in. They help us see things from different angles and from different points of view and perspectives. So I am fascinated by the possibility that something as kind of immense and in one sense kind of multi-tentacled and yet also very simple and clear has the potential to upend all these things that have been so fixed and that we have been trying to kind of deconstruct. And so I think how we can build this going forward and how artists can lead the way, as they often do, is to me the really exciting aspect of this. And less so on the kind of spectacle, selling something for millions of dollars, more so on how to kind of operationalize some of this, so it's not just these exceptions and these obscure events, but that the way that the art world or the art ecosystem functions and operates is fundamentally shifted as a result of this for the better, I would say. So to me, that's what the opportunity is in exploring this and probing this further. And I would also say that at MCA Denver, we really like to kind of poke at the pretentiousness of contemporary art, and we don't we recognize the gravitas that a lot of the work we do represents, and we also recognize that there's so much happening in popular culture that we can also kind of lend a perspective on. And so producing a program like this allows us to explore a topic that is knotty and complex and kind of extremely complicated, but to do so in a way that breaks it apart, not oversimplifying, but just helps us access it a little bit differently. And so I think that's the exciting thing about these conversations, is that it does hopefully introduce these key concepts in a manner that is not off-putting, I hope.
Yeah, I'm fingers crossed.
I have to look at the
or so I've read. I think just to respond to that briefly, I know we're winding down. The two things that really surface for me when you're talking that I would isolate as most important to me in the work that we're doing. One is, of course, we have to look at art through connoisseurship and judgment, and markets do that as well. But really honoring the dignity of the artistic process, which we also see in the sciences, the dignity of exploration, and honestly, the generosity that is asked of artists and scientists to put themselves and their work into the world before it's recognized or we know the value, and holding space for that storyline. And then also the idea of hospitality, the idea of truly inviting people into a conversation, and the way that I think hospitality is a kind of civic virtue of truly getting to work through ideas with each other. And so I just underscore how much we appreciate the comments and questions, and how much we really want this program to be for all of us in community figuring out these ideas. And I just want to thank you, Nora, for imagining this, and to you and your colleagues for hosting us.
Well, the thanks goes to you, Amy, and also, of course, to our wonderful audience who we can't see, but we know you're there, and we so appreciate your spending an hour just plus with us. And we hope you join us for the subsequent conversations that are coming up next week and the following 2 weeks. I also want to thank the amazing team at MCA Denver, notably Cheyenne, Courtney, Kelly, many, many, many others who helped bring this to life. And of course, to Stuart, to Scott, to David, to Marcia, and of course to Adam Lipsius. So many people to thank. There are so many others who were involved, and we're grateful for them and their participation. And thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.